Welcome into another edition of Making the Leap. Thanks a lot for downloading the show and checking it out. I think you're going to like this one today if you're a Christian school already in operation. Or maybe, we'd like to talk often to people that are thinking of starting one. Finances are always one of the biggest things.
It is one of the biggest, to try to figure out how you're going to get your money, where it's going to come from, what are parents going to think.
And even established Christian schools, I think, often struggle with how are we going to continue to stay afloat? Where do the resources come from? How do we grow?
Afloat, right. How do you grow? I think that's the next piece for a lot.
You've been a part of capital campaigns for Christian schools.
Yes.
Raising funds for expansions and growth. It's challenging, and it's one of the things, the reality is when we talk about private Christian education out there, it's what the Herzog Foundation is really dedicated to trying to do. And we talked a couple of weeks ago with our colleague Sadie.
Yes.
Sadie runs all kinds of different trainings, and one of the big focuses, one of the pillars of the Herzog Foundation training programs is this very notion of donor development and fundraising.
And I was talking with, during that conversation with Sadie, we were talking about somebody who had reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, please talk to some people about what it is to find, how do you grow your donors, not just the ones that you have that are on board, but how do you expand beyond that to parents or past parents that are already paying for their education, for their child's education. And then how do you meld that with your own personal finances?
So we're in luck today because here at the foundation, we host a lot of these trainings here.
One
at
of
our
the hundreds that she was talking about, yeah.
And we've never done this before either. We've never invited one of those coaches of those training sessions.
It's exciting to kind of see, just kind of leapfrog into all these new areas.
So meet our guest today. Cyra Lohman is one of our coaches. We brought her in from the St. Louis area. You live in Illinois, right, Cyra?
I do.
Welcome to the show.
I do. Thank you.
And you are part of our donor development coaching team.
Correct.
Yeah. How long have you done that now for us?
I've been, since Herzog Foundation got started about 4 years ago, they were looking at partners in different domains, right? So marketing and strategic planning and admissions and enrollment. And we were their donor development partner. So it's been about 4 years.
How have you seen this change? Yeah. Because we know when the foundation started, we were talking about this. Sadie was talking about it. We were kind of begging people to come be a part of it.
Please come help. Yes. You'll like it. It'll be good. And now it's kind of exploded.
Yeah.
Right.
You've probably seen it.
Yeah. So we've seen, we were just talking about that today. We'd be at trainings, with maybe 15 to 20 guests. And then I think the one this week, we're packed out. I know there's not one seat left.
Awesome.
And so I think just as, school leaders and faculty understanding what Herzog Foundation is doing and coming, but even, companies or ministries, we're a ministry that works with Christian schools and nonprofit Christian organizations. And so Herzog Foundation had really come and observed us leading other trainings like this. And Sadie Elliott and John Elliott came, and our founder, Zach Clark, was leading something down in Tennessee. And he didn't understand what this was or why they were there, but they were just vetting and watching. And so we were the first domain of training that they invited to be part of Herzog Foundation. So it's been really neat to watch you all grow.
I actually think that's really interesting, just because you the first group to come in, but yet I think finances, that has to be one of the first, outside of prayer. I can't think of a different thing that's as important to continue. Once you have someone interested, whether it's 2 kids, 10 kids, or 30 kids, you have teachers, staff, building. You have things you have to figure out. So I think that's neat that you kind of got in on that ground floor.
That's a good point.
But in the way that I think is most necessary.
Yeah, no one likes to talk about this part of it, but it's a necessary part of it, right? And I guess I would kind of ask you generally, first of all, what you have found in these 4 years that you've been coaching and talking with not even new schools, but established schools. What is the struggle? Because the money part of it is always the ugly part. It's like the cost of just tuition generally, never mind raising funds to operate and grow, right?
Yeah, so we've seen, it's interesting, established Christian schools, let's say you have a 170-year history, but with some broken trust, like different seasons of fracturing and rebuilding, sometimes built like exclusively on tuition. with, kind of higher wealth families that paid full tuition. And then all of a sudden we're looking to build a new building, or we've had broken trust. And so we see long-standing schools that did not develop like a giving model, a culture of generous giving, a culture of generosity in tandem with their tuition, struggling to now pivot and figure out how do we talk to families and alumni families about giving when we'd been exclusively driven as an economic engine by tuition. And then we also see smaller schools, and it's been really sweet to see Herzog Foundation have the mix of, maybe 2,000 person schools or 800 student schools that have been longstanding with these startup schools. The challenge those, of course, would face is how are we trying to develop our curriculum, enroll new students, establish a faculty, and talk to people about giving. And how do we do all that together? So different challenges in different size schools.
So even right there, I think that is a concept that for some is difficult to wrap their heads around, the idea of giving plus tuition. Mm-hmm. I speak from my own personal conversations that I've had with people, and their comment always is, we're already paying tuition and that's hard enough. And then you have to step aside to the concept of giving. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe what might be I know we're going to talk more about Herzog and about some of the coaching pieces, but that right there is probably one of the toughest pieces that even personally, I've had to kind of think through, like, well, I give to church, sure. I give to charitable organizations, I'm paying tuition, I don't have much more left to give. Yet, we are sitting here working in an organization and supporting an organization who is fostering that notion of giving. And you can't, I think you have to have both, but I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
That's right.
For parents that need maybe a little encouragement or a different way to maybe look at that idea of both.
And so parents and school leaders, the way to think about tuition being leveraged with giving is the first thing I would say is talking with families about a movement of Christian education across the nation to take back the education of our kids, talking about things like we want to establish a place for your grandkids to come, sewing scriptures under the soccer field. We'd be honored if you'd be part of this, even if that's a $75 a month commitment on top of tuition. Will you pray about that? So what you're doing there, and the best place to start is if you're a school leader, talking with families of the youngest kids within their first 2 years of attending the school. If you haven't talked with people about giving within the first couple years, it's hard to start then having conversations around giving with families. But even families raising young kids that don't have a whole lot of capacity to understand that this is a movement of Christian education, that we want to prepare a place for your grandchildren as their kids age and even maybe go to a different Christian high school and then a college. Maintaining that conversation and friendship, these folks eventually, our grade school years are our sweetest years a lot of times, and you see the fruit of what happened in that Christian school. So what we talk about is you're really trying to raise or build 30-year relationships with people. And so even if you're starting in a small place, just really teaching families how to think about giving to the school. Because ultimately, you don't want to talk about a gap or we have this margin or, it's our annual fund or operating fund. None of that's very exciting for families. But what we're working on with Herzog Foundation these 2 days with I think it's 30 or 35 schools that are here, it's developing a 10-year line of sight, a vision for your school that you're talking to families about. Giving is the fuel that moves us forward. So we have tuition leveraging with giving to create the full student experience. Tuition might cover $4,000 of a $12,000 student experience. Giving covers
You would rather see than, Cyra, a school that is based on donor giving as opposed to tuition all day long. So that is a healthy donor base is more important than maybe even enrolled tuition payers?
Well, it's both and, right? So there is a book called Rethinking Sustainability by Dr. Alan Pugh, who's also a coach with Herzog Foundation, and he teaches the financial planning section of Herzog's trainings. And he says 95% of your student experience should be funded by tuition and just 5% giving. So that's very different from what we have thought. But what he means is that's a really good bar to try to work toward. If you're, educating students that are from mixed income, low income families with a discipleship model, it's very hard to get to 95% tuition. But the two economic drivers are giving and tuition. And it really takes a mix of both to make the student experience happen.
This is what's changed in the post-COVID era, I'm sure, and I'm sure you've seen it and heard it from other schools. You talked about these legacy Christian schools that have been doing it for years and years and years, and maybe they didn't have a plan. But now what we're seeing is so many people fleeing public school for various reasons. And I won't get into the decision-making, but I will just say the fact is Christian schools are really exploding for all kinds of reasons, but they are. And so now you're talking about multiple groups of people with multiple socioeconomic backgrounds. Right. That changes an operation quickly financially, doesn't it?
That's right. That's right. And different schools have different models. Some Christian schools are pretty much, covenanted with the family, and you have two believing parents and a statement of faith, and it's a discipleship model. Other Christian schools, we're starting to see a lot more evangelical models in lower income regions, where the parents know the children will be trained up in the Lord, in Jesus, but the parents don't have to be of a faith background. And it's more of a discipleship, low-income Christian school right in the heart of urban areas. And so that's where it really been a neat opportunity to talk to non-families, non-enrolled families about giving to the school as a ministry.
And I'll shut up after this question to follow up on that. The schools that are taking on a lot of families who maybe don't have the means to pay full freight on tuition, doesn't that become, I hate to use the word burdensome because I know every Christian school has a heart to bring in everyone, but the reality is there's costs associated with that, and you can't just give it away.
Right.
So what are you telling people about that in terms of trying to grow and fundraise and operate, but help?
But also help the kids that are really and same with special education. A lot of times these things go hand in hand. Lower income families, some behavioral health needs, and even not that academic learning disabilities or physical disabilities would be tied to socioeconomics, but a lot of schools, Christian schools, are really trying to minister to the least as this influx after the pandemic has hit. So what we say is, you talk with your givers, even elderly people that believe Christian education is the solution to change the fabric of our nation, and so there's a why behind that. And then you're talking with people about this being a ministry. Often will say, we're not a business. If we were a Christian business, we would charge full tuition to every student that comes. But we're a ministry, and God uses his people to move his ministries forward. And so you leverage tuition with giving. And prayerfully, people that aren't involved in the school, don't have students in the school, actually become some of your leadership givers. We see that a lot.
That's what Pastor Johnston said to us.
Yes, we shared we had a guest on a couple weeks ago that shared a story about just a member of their congregation who came in, saw what was happening in their little school. I think less than 10 kids, just all together.
Brand new.
Said, literally started in this last year, and said, well, this is amazing, and turned around and donated the cost to basically cover the staff, the cost of the staff. And that's the buy-in that you need to have in seeing what it is doing within that community.
The entire church is full of senior citizens, frankly, who are well beyond kids in school year. But the young pastor said, we've got to get them to buy in. And as soon as they saw it, they started to give.
That's right.
That's the point.
Right.
Yeah, I worked with a school out in Greensboro, North Carolina, because we coach nationally and even internationally now. But they were right in the heart of an urban kind of an unseen kind of broken community with all infrastructure had really left that community. And what they were seeing was the wealthier elderly givers were understanding even the tax relief. Like if these students grow up and they are contributing to society and not draining from society, they aren't being institutionalized or imprisoned. So tax base, I forget what that's called. There's a financial curve that elderly people start to think about in terms of investing in the youth, because it was actually kind of a small inner city, and they were seeing such an impact after the school's 10 years on the crime rates and court involvement of teenagers. And so they became their highest investors because the families are not, they're barely maybe paying $200 a month in tuition, if that.
Right.
So it's really leveraged with giving when you're in that kind of model.
How does it work with here? So when you come in for a training, I know you're on the coaching end. How is it set up? I have not sat in on or been in a donor development training before. What does that look like for the 2 days that you guys are here
because
together?
we have friends that are on boards who have reached out to us and said, gosh, we'd like to get to a donor development training because we need to understand more. And so what would they learn?
That's a great question. You should sit in on one
I have a list of going
some of these different ones.
How I can.
So donor development, we so our ministry, development and leadership coaching, we work with Christian school leaders and nonprofit ministry leaders weekly on calls, 1 hour a week. So what we say at the Herzog trainings is it's like a year of coaching on steroids in 2 days. We really hit the headlines and condense a year of coaching into 2 days. So what happens for the Christian school leaders, sometimes it's a board chair and the head of school. Sometimes it's a faculty member who's learning to do donor development. And we joke about not saying the F word, which I probably shouldn't say on this podcast, but it's fundraising. Fundraising has a role. It's like chocolate sales, trivia nights, even golf tournaments, because you're raising funds.
Sure.
But when you're building relationships, so we call it donor development boot camp. And what it looks like for the 2 days is we unlearn some things like saying fundraising and asking in a first meeting. Then we develop that 10-year line of sight and actually build out a plan with each of the schools here. It's not a strategic plan that the board would vote on, but it's a kind of a public iteration of your internal planning for donors to invest in. So they leave with a full plan that has fundable tactics, like we call them giving-driven steps, because giving fuels the movement forward. And then they learn how to do a first meeting, leaders, how to connect a first meeting where you don't ask to an ask meeting, and how to thank and report after a gift before you ask again. So it's a good, and they develop a prospect list and that message that I talked about.
And it's full of a lot of information because while I have not sat in on a specific Herzog training, when I was working within that capital campaign, this was the information that they used. And so everything that you're saying, you're like, don't say fundraise, that kind of thing. And, making that ask, making that first ask, which was the scariest part and still is the part. I'm not really a wallflower. I'm not too afraid to say things, but to go to somebody and say, I'm asking you, I would like you to donate this much money or give this much money or support us with this much money. That's a really hard thing to do. And then you couple it with all the other responsibilities I think that administrators have. That's a lot because that's not in people's wheelhouse I think of it as like the politician thing. A politician has to go and sit down with everybody they know and say,
it was something,
will you support me?
Someone in politics once said to me that if you're not willing to sit in the living room of a loved one and ask them to give maximum campaign cash, you really need to understand. Don't run.
Right.
And that's a tough thing, but people that fundraise professionally have to think that way, don't they?
Yeah. So we always joke that no one really grows up thinking, I want to raise money when I grow up, right? But what happens is the Lord, like even for me, my journey was from a high school English teacher in public schools to, doing development face-to-face for Christian ministries. And it really is more of ushering God's people into what he's already doing. And so that part of that deprogramming and reprogramming, the way we think about this, is that we'd be remiss not to invite God's people to be part of what he's doing. And so when you think about it as we don't, and we also say, stop using the word needs. We need a gym. We need a building. It's really the why behind that. What does that building
What's it going to do?
Position you to do? It's raise up modern day Daniels and Esthers in a forever home where there's stability, that kind of thing.
Well, and I think about now, I mean, I don't know how often you have been up there yet, but at our school, one of the items, I guess, that resulted from the capital campaign, the kind of the phase that we were in, was a field. It's a multi-purpose field, so multiple sports will use it. And just driving past it, every time I'm like, I love that, just because there's kids out there now, and it's one more available space, but it's the cheerleading, it's the dance group that's out there, it's the the football team, it's the the baseball team,
Right.
it's the athletics during the day, it's a space for classrooms, and
That's awesome.
just getting to watch that growth and see it come to fruition, I think is a piece of it, which makes me really glad that I have gone out to say, would you help support this? And
Right.
because here's why, those communities that those kids are forming out there, that's huge. And of course, there's, classrooms and things like that behind it. But that part alone, I think has just been an amazing thing to witness and to see. And so it
That's
kind of
great.
brings it back to the why behind it.
Yeah, is it the thing I've always wondered, Cyra, is when you're starting a school versus you've been at an established school, what's the tougher position? Because I think we talk to a lot of people who are just getting started, and so they think to themselves, "Oh, I'm not going to have to think about fundraising for a
Giving,
long time.
donate,
I've just got to get kids in here to pay tuition."
Right.
So do you think it's better to start immediately thinking, not just starting a school, but the long goal?
Building that
Yeah.
giving.
How
I think so
yeah.
because, so one school I'm coaching is a 170-year-old Lutheran school in Texas, and they've never talked to people about giving. They've
Never.
just had a lot of space, part of the Lutheran Church, and now they're looking at a capital campaign because it's obviously a very aged building. And so she's like, now I feel like we have to start from scratch. These families have always come here and we've never talked to them about giving. How do I
giving in
change
addition
that?
to what they're already
To tuition,
giving.
yeah.
So you would say to people that are new, brand new, I'm going to open this Christian school in our church, it really would behoove them to start by thinking, in addition to curriculum and who we're hiring and all of that, they need to also think about their long-term financial model.
Right. So,
right?
yeah, and it's, absolutely. We would say as you're, developing your faculty, looking at admissions, it may not be the new families you're trying to enroll that you talk about yet, but people that are kind of sophisticated givers, obviously some of those leadership-minded and leadership-level givers, they know what it's like to ask for startup capital. A lot of these people have taken a chance and built something that never was before, and they needed to talk to investors in what they were doing. And so when you're a visionary head of school and you're starting something, even if it is for kind of two-parent higher income families. You talk with elderly businessmen who have retired and believe that education is a reclamation of our nation, and you ask them, would you consider a leadership gift to leverage tuition so that we can move forward faster?
Okay.
We believe we have a response to a demand for Christian education in our region. We believe we have a solution here. So I would start talking with if you're a new leader of a Christian school, maybe non-tuition paying families at first, but then within the first 2 years of enrollment, I'd start talking to your families, even if it's at small levels monthly. You're creating a culture of generosity among your parents and reprogramming that mindset to really understand that the full student experience, and the best way to do that is tuition is averaging $6,000 per family, but the full student experience is closer to $12,000 per student.
So can I ask about the full student experience?
Right.
I'm pretty sure I know what you're talking about, but maybe for a parent who is considering this, well, I would like to move my child from their public education, wherever they are, into this. But I know that once we're paying tuition and then we have to do these things on top, we want those families to receive the full student experience.
Sure.
But what is
What's that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does that mean
Yeah.
when you're talking about that for a new parent, a new family?
Question. Yeah. So we know that Christian school educators are usually earning maybe 70% of the benchmark salary in the public school district in their area. Maybe
I was
it's
told
closer to 40.
even less. I was told even when I was talking to I'll just say a leader in a school, and he said, take your salary and
Cut it in half.
Cut it almost in half.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So 50% would be more common, 70 to 80% would be generous
Would be
for
wonderful,
the schools that
right.
have a little more budget. So we say your teachers are already your biggest donors. So the kids are getting this experience with bright, loving faculty in front of them that are earning about 50% of what they could be earning. So already there's a part of the student experience that's unfunded.
Okay.
And so what if we're ever trying to really get to a point where we're compensating our faculty to attract and retain talent, we don't want to have a built-in deficit that we're just always going to pay our teachers 50% of what they could make. We'd actually really be wise to start working more toward the 70-80% of public school benchmarks. So that's part of that, what some people say gap or margin, but the student experience, what it really should cost is that built-in deficit that teachers are taking.
Okay.
There's also a piece of maybe a church is donating space, but we won't be there forever. Again, we have a built-in deficit of potentially $7 million because we want to build a school. So we're trying to create a student experience that honors the gifting God put in each kid. We want to develop a performing arts program and a speech team. So we might be dabbling in some of that, and that's part of the student experience, but we have this 10-year line of sight of where we really want to be. And so you're talking to families about what is currently now and where we're ultimately trying to go. But the biggest piece of the student experience would be the faculty. Yeah, salaries.
And I don't mean to take it in a negative place, but I think just operationally I'm interested in it, and that is where have you found the common roadblock is, or when they run into a ditch? Is there a common theme where an operating budget falters or school? I mean, we've heard of Christian schools that have had to close.
Sure.
And I'm sure not everybody's financially astute, or maybe there's a rough part of town or whatever. I mean, but
lots of reasons for that happening.
Are there common fundamentals financially where you see Christian schools struggle?
Wow.
Or is that?
I think probably different leaders in this space would say different things. Being resistant to raising tuition is a big piece of that. Like after the pandemic, we encourage it is the time to raise tuition. That doesn't mean families have to pay it in full. You might have a variable tuition model, but colleges are really good about talking about what the average family pays instead of what full tuition costs. That's a neat way to talk to a non-family donor is that our tuition now is $12,000. The typical family pays $6,000. Would you consider leveraging that for multiple students with a $30,000 gift? And so that might be a businessman or an elderly person in the community. So that's where we see people go wrong, is not raising tuition, not learning how to talk about what the typical family pays, while you also talk with givers about leveraging the full
to make up the difference of what some students are not paying, what families are not paying just for financial need, things like that.
And we have this inner dialogue of, well, most families can't pay $12,000. That's okay. Let them pay the $6,000. But let's start a model of giving because some families can pay the $12,000. We actually have a major donor panelist that comes and talks at our trainings. That's another piece of the boot camp, or we call them retreats. We used to call them boot camps. But she said, I have had my kids in this Christian school, and it's in the Kansas City region for years. She said, only this year did I realize that some families can't cover tuition. And I said, tell me how many you need covered. We will cover that. I mean, these are 6- and 7-figure givers. And so that's what sometimes school leaders have this storytelling going on, that no one can afford this. So they don't want to talk about giving. They don't want to raise tuition. But there are families, usually it's about 90% of giving comes from 10% of people. But when we refuse to talk about this, well, we don't know who those 90% or those 10% are.
Could I ask a theological question?
Yes.
Because this has been on my mind. I've always wondered this, and I've never asked it. Maybe this is a question for the pastor. But is giving to a Christian school the same as tithing to a church, in your point of view?
Oh, I love that question. And you probably should still ask a pastor.
I think we will ask a pastor.
I believe that a tithe is to go to the place you're being spiritually fed, if I understand Malachi well.
Okay.
So I think wherever you're being fed, even a couple pastors I listen to online, I have felt the Lord convicting me that beyond my tithe to my church, that I should be tithing to these men of God that are feeding me spiritually. Okay. And then I think that Christian school would be the offerings part of that, where the Lord is bringing the streets of heaven here to move ministries forward, would be the offering on top of the tithe, I think, but ask some pastors about that.
That makes sense.
That does.
Yeah.
So you would say that is an offering above tithing to your church?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most pastors, by the way, are going right on.
Be like, thank you for saying that. Yes.
They were afraid you were going to say, no, you're fine. Go ahead and give to the school.
You give wherever the Lord's calling.
Because I do think there are I know for a fact, 100%, there are people that say, I'm paying tuition to my children's school. That is, and I understand sometimes that is truly all you can do. But I also know I know 100%, we talk about this all the time. There's a lot I could cut out of our budget immediately to allow for some more generous giving
investments,
that I could be doing.
That's Dave Ramsey.
That's
right. Give, save, spend.
Give,
he still says tithe before, even if you're in
Give,
huge debt, still give first and then start paying off the debt.
100%, because then you're under covenant. It's like a marriage covenant. The Lord still loves you if you're choosing to live a different way than covenanted and protected in marriage, but you're not under his protection. And I say the same thing with a tithe. Like, it's the one area the Lord says to test him in giving.
Church operations, we're fascinated by what has still been, in our opinion, a lack of the church broadly, and I mean that across all faiths, embracing partnership with schools. Some are starting them, many haven't, and we believe should. There's a reticence there for a host of reasons, but I wonder, do you find church partnerships with Christian schools are helpful financially, or are they burdensome? Is there a struggle? What do you find there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you have a couple models, right? So covenanted with a specific church. I've seen people, like I'm coaching a ministry down in Texas, and it's Salem Lutheran School, and it's part of Salem Lutheran Church, and only students from Salem Lutheran Church come to Salem Lutheran School, and it's part of Salem Lutheran Ministries. Like, that is all one. But then I coach another school that has 30 congregations represented in their student body, and they are more of a discipleship model. So I said, you have a huge opportunity to talk with the churches about investing in the school. And they hadn't done that yet, but more like a ministry partnership. You might be a percentage of the budget. They might do a love offering twice a year. But there's opportunities there too.
A congregation would certainly be a helpful component to a school that's trying to raise regular funds, I would guess.
I would think so. Sometimes, in one situation we have right now, the church, all the parishioners give to the church, and it's designated in times to the school, but the school doesn't get to know the donor's name or the amount. And so then the school can't thank the donor, but the donor doesn't know that the school doesn't know who gave what. And so there's a huge gap, and there's some territory happening. So we're trying to engage the church on our coaching calls to help them understand that it's not competition. It's perceived competition, but there's a neat opportunity for both the church and the school.
That's interesting. I guess I really hadn't thought about not knowing who that donor is in order to thank them, because that's and I understand there are people, I've come across them, who don't want any they don't want any acknowledgement, and
some people want a cornerstone. Right? They want their name up there.
And I get that too, although everyone's got an opinion on it, and right.
That's a good question.
We do talk a lot about that. People that want their name etched in marble, or those that don't want anybody to know their school got the gift.
That's right. I had one nice donor. He said, if it would help you to use my name, because he was well loved and known, please go ahead, but otherwise I don't need to be named on anything.
It's funny too. I run into situations, I have run into this before, where you're about to reach out to somebody, or you're thinking you're going to, and I've been told don't contact that person. And there's I think what are considered some valid reasons on the end of the person telling me not to go ahead and contact that person. It's a Christian school, it might offend, it might do this, it might do that. Do you talk about that much, about who to approach and who to not approach? And, I was kind of taken aback to be told, like, that's probably, be careful if you do that, or be careful if you reach that person. And I thought, okay, interesting. I hadn't considered that before.
Yeah, it's hard to go to a secular business and say, give to this Christian school.
Go to the Christian school, right? Where I instead was, I wouldn't say guided, but it was heavily suggested, do this route first before you go that route. I just wondered if you talked about that at all.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about this being very much Holy Spirit level, Holy Spirit-led work. So we would encourage each, if you are a school leader, to develop about a list of 200 names, and it's prayerful work. I always ask the Lord, show me who we need to be talking to. And the currency you're after is influence and affluence and time and trust. So really the affluence is just a piece of this. And so sometimes the Lord will show you a name of someone doesn't have much capacity. But in my case, little Miss Jeannie, who had truly nothing. She lived in a trailer and was elderly. But she connected us with our first $100,000 gift. And she didn't even mean to, but the Lord knew. He kept saying, go talk to Miss Jeannie. So I would say as you're developing a list, it takes about 200 people to fuel a plan under $7 million. And usually 80% of giving comes from about 20% of people, but you want the 200 because that creates a lot of momentum. So you start with kind of a wide net, unless the Lord's saying, like, that was a person in the flesh saying I wouldn't talk to them. I've had some people that were like, truly, we call it green list. They have a lot of momentum. Green means go. And I was going to call these 4 that day. And the Lord was like, I don't have them for you. I don't want you to call any of them. And some things came out later where there was some malfeasance and some reputation repair that needed to be had, and we weren't to do anything with them. So if the Lord puts a spirit stop, otherwise I would say ask him and then develop a list of about 200. And then you never know. You can't say the right thing to the wrong person. You can't say the wrong thing to the right person. And even as you're asking for a significant gift, one of my favorite lines is, I don't know who the Lord's going to use, but I know he's going to use someone because he uses his people. And we're praying people make decisions at the $500,000 level because we know that's what it's going to take. Wow. I don't know who you know that we should know. I don't know if you're someone I should be talking to. That's usually the way we'll approach like higher capacity folks that might have an interest in Christian schools.
Cyra, do schools, ours for instance, does an annual capital campaign to hit this certain amount that they need to build the thing that they want to build. That's different than a sustained
operational cost.
Well, but just a sustained plan for giving, right? That's different. So I guess I'm just saying, functionally, you said a fundraiser, bake sales and big galas or whatever.
Yeah, transactional fundraising, right?
Is that different? Is that effective?
Great question, Chris.
You know?
Yeah. So we would say this is what everyone's doing here at boot camp at Herzog Foundation this week is every school is in a capital campaign or is in a campaign. They just don't know it. They might be in an endowment campaign. They're trying to raise sustainable funding. They might be in a capital campaign or capital project. And even annual giving is a campaign of sorts. So what we would encourage you to do is think about that 10-year line of sight with usually 3, no more than 4 strategic priorities that you're always working on now and in 10 years. We'll be forming faith. We'll be, kind of raising up leaders, servant leaders, whatever. And so what we would encourage is all of the ways of giving, the galas, the capital project that we're working on, those are just tributaries feeding the same stream. It's a 10-year plan. Okay. And so that way, and then also the capital campaign, anytime, it's not really about that new gym, it's really about drawing on the giftedness God put into certain kids, giving them a space to develop their gifting. The why behind that, right? So you still have a why behind it in your 10-year plan, but our near-term focus is on this capital project. And the more you can align everything you're doing, capital projects, the gala, and you're always talking about our long-term plan driven by 3 strategic priorities, our near-term focus is whatever the project is. And that way, because to donors, especially sophisticated folks, it feels like, oh, here we go again. Now they need a roof. Now they need a gym. It's 100%. Another project. And it feels very splintered instead of alignment. 100%. We're just moving the plan. Fuel is,
because
giving is the fuel.
You could have very wealthy people who feel like, good grief, again? Right?
Yeah, there's no strategy
you're knocking
to this.
again?
Yeah.
I just gave you $1 million.
Or you have the family that's like, I feel like I'm doing all I can, and now it's one more thing.
So that is an error that a school could make if you constantly sound like you're knock, knock, knock. Could we have another 100 what a grand to build this or add that? You don't want to be that.
Yeah, and so not everybody's ready for like a multi-year giving decision, but if you have a family that does have some capacity, rather than talking to them every project at a time, you might talk about a $500,000 multi-year commitment. And these would be our near-term focus projects.
And then leave them alone.
And you do that with a certain group. Yeah.
Like do it once.
Exactly.
And
then you just let them be. And what's beautiful is a lot of times the folks that make a long multi-year commitment still give, at the end of the year to your campaign and that kind of thing.
I can see that because I do know that when when we're veering off, and it was it feels necessary. We know it's necessary when we're working on a capital campaign that's going to take 3 to 4 years to kind of manifest. Well, then over here, the fund that's being normally collected for tuition assistance is depleting, and now it's going here, and you're trying to bring it all together. It's all the same, right?
Exactly.
That's hard, and it's hard for people to understand. I think sometimes it's hard. I'm in those meetings. I've been in them, and I hear it, and even then, I'm kind of like,
oh goodness, yeah.
What does it matter? Aren't we all doing isn't it all for one thing? But logistically, we need this money. There's a lot of nuance to it and vision that I don't understand.
You have to have vision.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
That's right.
That's what you learn at these trainings, by the way.
That is what you got to vision.
Obviously, people couldn't make this one that you're here for, but you do these all over the country with the foundation,
That's right.
don't you?
I think we have 8 this year. Donor development boot camps.
So still time to go to herzogfoundation.com and look for the donor development training.
That are throughout the country. They're not just here.
If you can travel to one, remember the deal is with the foundation is if you can travel to one.
If you get yourself there.
We cover everything.
Yep. Absolutely.
The foundation covers everything.
That's
Isn't that cool?
Wonderful. It's beautiful. Yeah, and if you come to the one in Kansas City, this is such beautiful headquarters. But I know that we, if it's too far to travel, we really do try to be in several population centers across the country, right? Herzog Foundation throughout the year. So
this has been great.
I really appreciate you sharing your time and your I guess I would say your wisdom and answering some of the tougher questions that I think people have. And I'm sure we'll be in touch going forward because I would love to have more of these conversations.
And we'll put some more information in the show notes about maybe if people would like to reach you or find out more about training.
Absolutely.
Cyra. Great to meet you in person. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Yes.
Good to meet you.
And that will do it for this week's edition of Making the Leap. Thanks a lot for checking it out, and we'll see you next time right here.
Making the Leap is a podcast presentation courtesy of the Herzog Foundation. Please rate and comment on the show, as well as subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Making the Leap.